Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Saturday, December 6th, 2025, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 71 degrees, with a low dipping to 48, so expect a mild day with some cooler evenings ahead. Coming up, we'll examine why President Trump is criticizing European allies, even as he strengthens American influence across the Americas, and explore a federal judge's skepticism over Trump's continued authority in directing the California National Guard. Plus, other key stories on global tensions, domestic policy shifts, and more. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. Good morning. The White House just released President Trump's new national security strategy. Ethan, bring us up to speed on what dropped and when.
The administration published its 33-page strategy yesterday, December 5th, making it the first formal overhaul since President Trump returned to office in January. It's the congressionally required blueprint for how the White House sees threats and priorities. NPR, citing the Associated Press, says it's a sharp pivot from the 2022 Biden strategy, which leaned on alliances, especially after Russia invaded Ukraine. This one recenters the Trump-era America First approach. Less multilateralism, more unilateral leverage.
How different is the tone from the last go-round?
Pretty striking. NPR and the AP describe it as chilly and bellicose, with unusually biting language aimed at European allies. It's not just a policy shift. It's a philosophical reset that casts many partners as drifting, unreliable, or even self-sabotaging. The text leans into skepticism of big alliances and emphasizes what the White House frames as hard-edged American primacy.
Let's start with Europe. What's the core critique?
The document paints Europe as weakened by its own choices, immigration policy, falling birth rates, and alleged elite censorship among them. It warns of a, quote, real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure, end quote, and claims some NATO states could become majority non-European within decades. According to NPR's write-up of the text, it argues the EU and certain governments trample democratic principles to mute opposition. It also questions whether Europe's economies and militaries can stay robust enough to be reliable allies.
That's explosive language. Any direct quotes beyond that warning?
Yes. The strategy speaks of a continent that, quote, will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less, end quote, if present trends continue. It also asserts that, quote, certain NATO members will become majority non-European, end quote, and accuses leaders of suppressing dissent on the Russia-Ukraine war. Those are not typical lines in a U.S. strategy document, and AP reporting emphasizes how unusual the rhetoric is for a formal White House doctrine.
How do experts say that stacks up against the facts?
Groups like the Council on Foreign Relations say the rhetoric leans hard into far-right talking points and misreads Europe's trajectory. CFR's analysis yesterday called it a wake-up call for Europe, but argued it stokes fear rather than engages reality. Pew data complicates the picture in spring 2025 surveys. A median of 23% in key Western European countries called immigration a top concern, and 62% across 25 nations viewed the EU favorably. And Eurostat projections, highlighted by the Washington Post and CSIS, suggest zero immigration would speed Europe's demographic decline, intensifying aging and economic strains.
Does the strategy actually praise Europe's far-right parties?
It does. The document frames the rise of anti-immigration, nationalist parties, as signs of a revival of spirit. It says, quote, America encourages its political allies in Europe to promote this revival, end quote, arguing their growing influence offers cause for optimism. That's a notable departure from the traditional U.S. habit of staying neutral on Europe's internal partisan debates, as NPR and CFR both point out.
How did European leaders react overnight?
Largely with dismay, though not universally. Germany's foreign minister, Johann Wadephul, said the U.S. remains NATO's most important ally, but added, quote, We also don't think that anyone needs to give us any advice on freedom of expression or societal organization, end quote, according to NPR and the AP. The Washington Post reports centrist leaders were aghast, with Chancellor Friedrich Merz and President Emmanuel Macron warning against playing games with alliances. One outlier, Germany's AfD lawmaker Markus Fraunmeier, praised it as a reality check, per AP and CBS News.
What about NATO's chief?
Secretary General Mark Rutte reaffirmed backing for Ukraine and brushed aside claims that Europe is blocking peace talks, according to the Atlantic Council and Brussels Signal coverage from yesterday and today. He's trying to keep the alliance message steady despite the political crosswinds. At the same time, the new strategy urges Europe to stand on its own feet, a line that resonates differently in Berlin and Warsaw than in Washington.
There's a spending target in there, right?
The strategy proposes NATO allies lift defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, far beyond the current 2% benchmark. Analysts at places like the Cato Institute cast it as logical burden sharing, but Eastern European governments worry it might be paired with weaker U.S. security guarantees. That tension, pay more, get less certainty, could be the crux of the next few years of alliance politics, as military.com and policy experts have flagged.
Let's pivot to the Western Hemisphere. What's this Trump corollary I'm hearing about?
It's a revival and expansion of the Monroe Doctrine concept, now explicitly rejecting meaningful influence by other powers in the Americas, including economic influence. The text calls the North Atlantic an American lake and emphasizes preemptive actions to prevent foreign footholds, as detailed in USNI News and Lawfare's excerpts posted yesterday. According to AP coverage carried by My Northwest and the Anchorage Daily News, the administration wants to restore American preeminence in the hemisphere and prioritize border security, cartel suppression, and supply chain control.
How aggressive is the approach to cartels?
Very. The strategy backs targeted deployments and, when necessary, the use of lethal force against cartels, replacing what it calls a failed law enforcement-only approach. NPR notes the administration has already struck suspected trafficking vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific as part of a pressure campaign. It sparked debate on NPR podcasts about whether this amounts to war by another name, especially amid talk of confronting Venezuela's Maduro.
What does this mean for Latin American partners?
It could strain relations, even as Washington seeks cooperation. The Council on Foreign Relations and the Atlantic Council warn that treating the Americas as the highest priority with a unilateral edge risks reviving fears of U.S. interventionism. Many governments share concerns about crime, migration, and Chinese influence, but they bristle at the idea of Washington dictating terms. Balancing hard power with diplomatic buy-in will be the test.
You mentioned China. How does the strategy treat Beijing?
It's a rebalance, not a retreat. The White House wants allies to step up defense spending to deter Chinese aggression, including over Taiwan, while keeping U.S. military superiority. CSIS analysts say it frames the U.S. as leader of a network, but with less willingness to carry the full load. It pairs tariffs and economic pressure with calls for allied responsibility, consistent with the administration's broader theme.
And what's the plan on Ukraine?
The document says ending the war is a core U.S. interest to reestablish strategic stability with Russia, not primarily to vindicate Kyiv. PBS News and The Guardian report the White House envisions a U.S.-brokered cession of hostilities leaving Ukraine viable, but outside NATO and with a smaller army. That echoes several Russian positions and reportedly wasn't shaped with European or Ukrainian input. Allies fear it recasts the U.S. as an independent arbiter instead of NATO's anchor.
Does that risk splitting the alliance?
It could. Friends of Europe and Time have flagged real anxiety that a Washington-led deal might undercut Ukraine's sovereignty and Europe's security calculus. If the U.S. pushes for concessions without allied consensus, it amplifies the unease already stirred by the Europe chapter's rhetoric. The credibility of Article 5 and the unity that defined 2022 are both in play.
How about the Middle East? Any change there?
The strategy turns down the volume. It criticizes past U.S. hectoring of Gulf monarchies and advocates organic reforms while focusing on investment partnerships enabled by reduced dependence on oil, as NPR notes. That's consistent with the resource shift toward the Western Hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific, where the White House sees higher returns on attention and force posture.
Step back for me. What's the big picture here?
It's a regionalist reset that draws the perimeter closer to home. The U.S. will be more assertive in the Americas, more transactional with Europe, and selective about where it spends military capital. Defense News and the Los Angeles Times caution it may provoke European backlash without improving American security if coordination frays. Still, the White House argues that decades of overextension left the homeland exposed and the economy vulnerable.
Are there legal or procedural footnotes we should know?
A couple. The document fulfills a statutory requirement to submit a national security strategy to Congress, and the official text is posted on whitehouse.gov, with archival versions noted on the Federal Register and archives.gov. Outlets like USNI News, Lawfare, and Breaking Defense have hosted excerpts since yesterday. It's not law, but it shapes budgets, force posture, and interagency planning for years.
What are Democrats on Capitol Hill saying?
Congressman Jason Crow of Colorado called it catastrophic, arguing it undermines U.S. standing and endangers security by pulling back from partnerships. That critique, reported by NPR and the AP, echoes a broader Democratic concern that abandoning multilateralism increases risk and reduces leverage. The White House counters that allies will only do more if Washington stops doing it for them.
Does public opinion line up with any of this?
It's mixed. Pew's spring polling showed strong EU favorability and limited immigration as top issue intensity in Western Europe, which cuts against the document's alarm. In the U.S., concerns about border security and fentanyl trafficking have grown, which aligns with the strategy's hemispheric focus. But sustained support for Ukraine and NATO remains notable in many surveys, creating a political balancing act.
What's the near-term impact we should watch for this week?
First, Allied statements. Expect more European capitals to push back through the weekend as leaders digest the 5% defense demand and the democracy criticisms. Second, operational signals any uptick in maritime interdictions against traffickers or new asset deployments in the Caribbean would show the Trump corollary moving from page to practice. Third, Ukrainian and Russian reactions to the peace framework language, which could shape the next diplomatic beat.
Are there any numbers or specifics you think are being overlooked?
Demographics are key. The Eurostat projection cited by the Washington Post suggests Europe without immigration could fall to around 295 million people by 2100, with a sharply aging population, about 36% over 65 straining pensions and growth. Those figures complicate the strategy's warning that immigration alone erodes Europe. It may be both a pressure point and a potential solution. That nuance is missing from the document's rhetoric, as CFR points out.
Last one. Bottom line for Americans waking up to this?
The White House is telling you the priority is the neighborhood. Ports, borders, air and sea lanes from the Arctic to the Panama Canal, and that allies should carry more of their own weight. It's a gamble that hard lines and fewer entanglements will make the U.S. safer and richer. Critics warn it could isolate America and fracture the coalitions that deter wars in the first place. The next few months will test which theory holds.
Ethan, thanks for walking us through it.
Anytime, Grace.
This morning, a federal judge in San Francisco sounded skeptical about the Trump administration's control of California's National Guard. Chloe's here to break down what that means and why it matters. Hey, Chloe, what's the core dispute?
It's a fight over who controls California's Guard troops and for how long. According to Associated Press reporting carried by the San Francisco Chronicle and Cap Radio, President Trump federalized more than 4,000 Guard members back in June without Governor Gavin Newsom's consent, citing violent unrest tied to immigration enforcement protests. California says the move was unconstitutional and that keeping those troops under federal command months later crosses the line into domestic policing barred by the Posse Comitatus Act.
So remind us how this started. What happened back in June?
The administration escalated immigration enforcement, including mass deportation operations, and protests erupted in Los Angeles, some turning violent. AP accounts, echoed by the Boston Globe, describe vandalism, arson, and confrontations around a downtown federal detention center, with guard troops first protecting the facility and then supporting ICE by securing perimeters and shielding agents. Cap Radio's coverage underscores that this support role made California fear the Guard had effectively become a federal police force in city streets.
And the legal hook the White House used, what authority are they citing?
They're leaning on Title 10 of the U.S. Code, especially Section 12,406, which lets a president call up state guard units if there's invasion, rebellion, or an inability to execute federal laws with regular forces. The Justice Department argues that the June unrest created a rebellion or danger of rebellion against the execution of immigration laws under Title 8. As the Bangor Daily News summarized from AP correspondents, the administration says that discretion sits with the president and courts shouldn't second-guess it.
How has California pushed back?
Attorney General Rob Bonta sued in June, arguing the move trampled the 10th Amendment and state sovereignty. According to Cap Radio and the Bangor Daily News, Bonta has said the president was treating the Guard as, quote, a traveling private army to deploy where he wants, when he wants, for as long as he wants, for any reason he wants, or no reason at all, end quote. California's position is that the protests, while serious, never met the legal threshold of a rebellion, and using the Guard to bolster ICE operations runs straight into posse comitatus limits.
Didn't the judge already rule once before? Where does that stand?
He did. In September, after a full trial, U.S. District Judge Charles Breyer found the deployment violated the Posse Comitatus Act as reported by the SF Chronicle and the Sacramento Bee. He pointed to activities like crowd control, traffic blockades, and direct support for arrests, roles that blur military and law enforcement lines, and issued an injunction to stop similar future uses. But the Ninth Circuit put that ruling on hold pending appeal.
Okay, now to yesterday's hearing. What was Judge Breyer questioning?
Breyer pressed the Justice Department on why federal control was still necessary when conditions have calmed. The Guardian and Courthouse News Service describe him as openly skeptical, telling DOJ lawyer Eric Hamilton, quote, no crisis lasts forever. I think experience teaches us that crises come and crises go. That's the way it works, end quote. When Hamilton argued the president has exclusive authority to keep the Guard federalized, Breyer quipped, quote, in other words, like diamonds, it's forever, end quote, and pushed for concrete proof that state and local authorities can't protect federal assets.
What's the situation on the ground now? How many troops are left?
By late October, the presence had shrunk to several hundred statewide, and roughly 100 around Los Angeles. AP summaries carried by the Bangor Daily News say those units focus on protecting federal buildings and facilitating ICE operations, not broad city patrols. Breyer pointed to that drawdown as a tacit admission that the supposed danger has subsided, especially as protests since midsummer have been smaller and mostly peaceful, according to local reports.
Did the DOJ point to any new threats to justify staying in charge?
Yes. Hamilton highlighted a December 1st incident in which a 54-year-old man, Jose Francisco Jovel, allegedly threw Molotov cocktails at a federal building in downtown LA. The Los Angeles Times and CBS News reported he was immediately arrested, and he shouted about immigration policy, calling it a terrorist attack. DOJ framed that as evidence of lingering danger, but California replied that local police handled it without Guard help, showing state and city capacity is intact.
How is the administration making the legal case for, hands-off, judicial review?
They cited older cases like Luther versus Borden and more recent ones like Gilligan versus Morgan to argue courts should defer to executive judgments about military operations. The Bangor Daily News and Cap Radio recapped DOJ's view that decisions about federalizing the Guard to execute federal law are political questions, or at least deserve substantial deference. But Breyer signaled he sees limits, referencing the need for evidence of state incapacity and noting there are tens of thousands of active duty troops in California if the federal government truly needs resources that don't implicate posse comitatus.
Is the Insurrection Act in play here?
Not directly. According to the Washington Post and analyses from the Brennan Center, the administration has explored invoking the Insurrection Act in related contexts because it sidesteps posse comitatus, but it hasn't done so in this case. Instead, DOJ is still anchored in Title X's execute the laws rationale, which is precisely what California says cannot be used to turn the Guard into domestic law enforcers over the state's objection.
What about historical precedents? How unusual is this?
It's rare. Experts cited by Reason and the Cato Institute point out that federal Guard activations over a governor's objection have been unusual in modern times, and typically short-lived, not open-ended. The limited 1992 Los Angeles riots deployment had gubernatorial consent, and even the famous Little Rock crisis in 1957 involved a targeted stand for desegregation, not a prolonged support role for routine federal policing.
You mentioned the Ninth Circuit a minute ago. How have the appeals shaped this?
The Ninth Circuit twice stayed Breyer's orders. First, the temporary restraining order returning control to the state, and later his permanent injunction from September. So federal command continued while the appellate courts review the merits. As of today, December 6, 2025, there's been no Supreme Court involvement, but given the stakes, outlets like the SF Chronicle suggest it could climb to the justices. The question likely to draw review is how far a president's necessity claim can go without running afoul of posse comitatus and state sovereignty.
Did similar deployments in other states face pushback?
They did. The Bangor Daily News reported the administration tried to redirect some California Guard units to Portland and Chicago, part of a broader strategy to confront resistance from progressive city leaders. Federal judges in those places blocked or curtailed the moves on similar posse comitatus grounds, signaling that courts outside California share the concern about using federalized Guard troops for domestic enforcement roles.
How strong does California's case look after yesterday?
Stronger than it did going in. Courthouse News Service and The Guardian both describe Breyer as unimpressed with claims of indefinite presidential discretion, especially given reduced unrest and ample local police resources. California's Solicitor General emphasized that since October, the data show minimal incidents and that the December 1st attack was isolated and swiftly handled, a narrative echoed by the LA Times and confirmed by state reports.
What exactly is California asking for right now?
A preliminary injunction to return control of the remaining troops to the state while the appeals continue. Bonta argues that every day under federal command normalizes domestic military involvement in policing, something he says the Constitution and posse comitatus prohibit. PBS News and the SF Chronicle reported that he warned of a precedent that could let any president deploy state troops to enforce policy, even in the face of local opposition.
And Judge Breyer hasn't ruled yet?
Not yet. He said he'd decide soon, according to Courthouse News Service and the San Mateo Daily Journal. But as of today, December 6, 2025, no order has been posted. The tone of the hearing suggests a win for California is possible, though the Ninth Circuit could again slow any transition back to state control.
What constitutional lines are really at stake here?
Two big ones: the boundary between federal power and state sovereignty, and the line between military and civilian policing. The Associated Press and the Boston Globe note that Breyer anchored his earlier ruling in the Posse Comitatus Act, while referencing precedents like Sterling v. Constantine, which confirmed courts can review executive military actions, and Martin v. Mott, which recognized presidential discretion but not absolute immunity. The outcome will help define how far a president can go in using National Guard forces domestically over a governor's objection.
The judge asked why regular military isn't used if needed. Why does that matter?
It underscores that the president has alternatives that don't commandeer state troops for policing. Breyer pointed out that California hosts tens of thousands of active duty personnel who can protect federal facilities in a purely federal chain of command, though posse comitatus still limits their law enforcement role absent specific authorization. That question undercuts the idea that federalizing the Guard indefinitely is the only way to keep ICE agents and buildings safe.
How are critics and supporters framing this more broadly?
International outlets like The Independent and Business Standard call it a test of democratic checks, whether courts can restrain sweeping executive claims tied to public order. Domestic coverage from Cron.com and SF Gate, along with KTVB's aggregation, emphasizes the civil liberties risk if military forces, even the Guard, are normalized in street-level enforcement. Meanwhile, the administration's allies argue, as captured by BDN and Cap Radio, that failing to protect federal law execution invites more violence and undermines national authority.
What about public safety right now? Are protests still ongoing?
They continue, but they're smaller and largely peaceful compared with June's peak. Local law enforcement has repeatedly said they can handle them, and AP updates noted that the Guard presence has already been ratcheted down since late summer. The December 1st attack was a jarring exception, but it also became DOJ's main example of an ongoing threat in an otherwise calmer landscape.
If California wins this injunction, what happens next?
The remaining troops would revert to state control, and the permanent injunction Breyer issued in September, currently paused, would get a practical boost in California even as appeals proceed. Other states, like Oregon and Illinois, where judges have rebuffed similar deployments, could treat it as persuasive momentum against federalized Guard policing. And legal experts told Reason and the Cato Institute that a clean win might fast-track Supreme Court review of how reviewable a president's necessity call really is.
And if the administration hangs on?
Federal command would continue, likely until the Ninth Circuit rules on the merits, and perhaps longer if the Supreme Court steps in later. That would mean Guard support for ICE around federal facilities in Los Angeles persists, even as the troop footprint stays relatively small. Politically, it would validate a model of prolonged federalization that California warns could spread to other policy fights.
Anything else shaping the backdrop here we should know?
The state-federal friction goes beyond the Guard. Cap Radio reported Newsom has separately used the Guard for humanitarian tasks tied to federal funding delays, like assisting with food programs during shutdown turbulence, underscoring that the Guard's core state mission is not policing. And Senator Adam Schiff's criticism, noted in local coverage, adds pressure on the administration to justify why, 6 months later, federal command is still the right tool.
Bottom line, what should listeners watch for in the next few days?
Watch for Breyer's ruling on the preliminary injunction, he said, soon, and given yesterday's hearing was December 5th, a decision could land any day now. If he grants it, expect rapid motions at the Ninth Circuit and a scramble over timelines for handing control back to the state. If he denies it, California will likely appeal immediately and lean on public messaging that posse comitatus isn't optional, even in tense times.
Chloe, thanks for walking us through it.
Always, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Tennessee's final special election of the year paints a red seat with a blue undertone. Republican Matt Van Epps holds the 7th district, but by only about 9 points in a district Donald Trump carried by 22 just last year. That's a 13-point leftward lurch, matching a year-long pattern of Democrats outperforming baselines by roughly 14 points in special contests from Florida to Virginia. Bottom line, the GOP keeps the seat and the House at 219 to 213, but the scoreboard says momentum may be migrating. For 2026, Republicans see a warning sign. Democrats see a warming sign. Wall Street ended the week within a whisker of record territory, flirting but not quite committing. The S&P 500 added about 0.2%, closing within 0.3% of its all-time high. The Dow climbed roughly 104 points to 47, 954.99, while the Nasdaq rose 0.3%. Tame inflation has traders betting the Fed will trim rates at its final meeting of the year, easing market nerves after weeks of chop. Add in a mega media mashup boosting the entertainment sector, and investors found more sizzle than fizzle. Despite hand-wringing over AI froth and crypto hiccups, the tape showed resilience, proof that the bull still has some hoof. Speaking of show business, Netflix is queuing up a blockbuster of its own, entering a definitive agreement to acquire Warner Bros. Studio and streaming crown jewels, including HBO and Max, in a cash-and-stock deal valued near $82.7 billion. The plan, Warner Bros. Discovery, spins off its linear networks, think CNN and Discovery, into a separate entity first, then Netflix rolls credits on the scripted side. The move could marry Netflix's global subscriber muscle with Warner's wizarding and dragon-sized IP, pressuring rivals to merge or be merged. But regulators may not binge this season. Lawmakers across the aisle and industry guilds call it anti-competitive. The Writers Guild warns of fewer jobs and thinner menus for viewers. Analysts dub it daring and pricey, with a closing window of 12 to 18 months after the cable carve-out, eyed for Q3 2026. In short, a real risk with blockbuster ambitions. The FAA is taxiing into turbulence with major U.S. airlines, opening an investigation into whether carriers ignored emergency orders to trim flights during the recent 43-day government shutdown. With air traffic controllers stretched thin, the agency directed up to a 6% schedule reduction at 40 high-traffic airports. Yet preliminary data show cancellation rates hovering around 0.25% even when deeper cuts were called for, raising safety and compliance questions. Each flight flown in violation could cost up to $75,000, turning runway math into runaway fines. Airlines have 30 days to prove they played by the rulebook or explain why they didn't. The probe underscores lingering fallout from a shutdown that ended November 12th and heightens friction with the Transportation Department. And in Louisiana, outrage is boiling after a viral video showed masked agents chasing 23-year-old U.S. citizen Jocelyn Guzman in Marrero during Operation Catahoula Crunch. Mayor-elect Helena Moreno and Representative Troy Carter condemned the tactics as indiscriminate and chilling. DHS says agents mistook her for a suspect and stood down once informed. With hundreds of agents deployed and a stated goal of 5,000 arrests, city leaders allege racial profiling and demand unmasking and transparency. It's a crackdown drawing a backlash as New Orleans asks for law without the saw. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 2.5, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.